How do you go from an idea, a concept, to building a product, launching it, and putting it in the hands of hundreds, if not thousands of customers? What are all of the things that you need to do in order to bring an idea to life? What are all of the considerations that go into actually developing a software product? And who should be involved in every stage of building that product? These are all of the questions that I'm going to be answering for you in this video as I talk about the product development lifecycle. So what is the product development lifecycle? Well, a quick Google tells me the product development process is a 6-stage plan that involves taking a product from initial concept to final market launch. And it looks a little something like this. Product development lifecycle is not to be confused with the product lifecycle. So the product lifecycle is the length of time from a product first being introduced to customers until it is removed from the market. So basically, the stages that a product goes through in its life from launch all the way through to discontinuation. And that looks a little something like this. Side by side, you can see that the two are actually quite different. A couple of other things about the product development lifecycle is that it is not linear. It looks like a nice, pretty, streamlined circle in this picture, but it is nothing but. There will be lots of iteration, lots of looping, lots of crossover, lots of things happening in parallel through every one of these phases. You don't just start from A and finish at Z. Secondly, different companies and people will approach the product development lifecycle in slightly different ways. For the most part, the bigger phases that you need to go through still stand, but exactly how you approach and execute each of the phases will differ a little bit depending on if you are a really large company, if you are a startup, if you are doing agile product development versus doing waterfall product development. That can be a whole separate topic of its own. There are lots of different tools and frameworks available to actually support you in the work that is required through each one of these phases. And there is no right or wrong. Again, it is about personal preference. It is about the requirements you have for specific tools and frameworks, and just the one that you prefer or the one that perhaps your company prescribes. In this video, I'm going to be taking you through a detailed walkthrough of every phase of the product development lifecycle. I have created an absolutely crazy mind map, brainstorm, flowchart. It is colorful, it is complex, it is very comprehensive, if I must say so. And this is going to be really good for those of you who are visual learners. You will have an artifact to actually take away with you. I promise to make this a downloadable file. And if you watched my previous video on everything that a product manager actually does, I followed a very similar format. And a lot of you really loved that video. So if that was of value to you, this one is really going to be quite complementary to that one. In this video, I'm taking you through what each phase is, its purpose, the intended outcome of that phase, the artifacts you should produce in that phase, the specific tasks you should be working on as a product manager in those phases, and the people you should be collaborating with in those phases. Whether you work in a startup or you work in a bigger tech company, if you're ever lost about where you are in the process of taking an idea from an idea, concept, all the way through to a product that is in the hands of customers, this is the only video you will ever need, I promise you. Shortly, I'm going to be sharing my screen and we will actually be creating this diagram together, and I will talk you through every single step. I have broken up my diagram into 3 distinct areas. The first area is discovery, the second is planning, and the third is execution. And the reason I've done this is because there is so much entailed in each phase that at a quick glance you can kind of figure out, are you very early on in the project, are you towards the end because you're building and you're almost at launch, or are you really in the trenches? You are deep into figuring out what on earth you're going to be building. You have a really good idea, you've validated it, but now you need to figure out the how it's all going to come to life. So who is this video for? Anyone at all who is interested in how you can go from an idea all the way through to a product in the hands of customers. You might work in a big tech company, you might work in a startup, you might be a developer or a product manager or a designer or a marketer. It really doesn't matter. If you are involved or interested in being involved in any part of bringing a product to life, then this video might be useful to you. And if you're wondering who I am and why I might have some credibility to talk about this, it's because I have been working in the tech industry for about 10 years. In that time, I've worked in various product development or product management related roles at some of the world's biggest hyper-growing tech companies. I've also founded a couple of my own startups in between my various tech jobs, and so I've seen things being built at scale, and I've experienced and hands-on built things from the ground up myself. I've had the opportunity to work on some pretty complex, technical, and challenging products in my product management career to date. And through that experience, I have learned so much about the product development lifecycle that, quite frankly, I've never really seen shared anywhere or documented anywhere. No one really tells you what you need to do in order to bring a product to life. I think the reason for that is because there are lots of different ways in which you can approach building a product. There isn't necessarily a super prescriptive list of tasks and deliverables or artifacts that you absolutely have to produce in a certain way. You can kind of pick and choose, you can bring your own flavor to it, and it really depends on the nature of your product, your industry, your company, and there are just a lot of factors that can affect it. To start with, I'm going to break up the canvas into 3 different sections so we can concentrate each of the different phases in the product development lifecycle to either discovery, planning, or execution. Next, I'm going to plot each of the phases across these sections. We'll start with ideation, and then ideation will link to research. Okay, and then we have product definition. Okay, then we have solution design. Okay, and then we have development, and then we have launch. Now remember that the product development lifecycle doesn't always work in a linear fashion. Yes, ideally you will start with an idea, you will do your research, you will do a bunch of planning before you get to actually developing it. But in reality, you can move back and forth between the different phases, as well as doing a lot of the phases in parallel. So keep in mind, even though I'm putting this in swim lanes, it looks like everything is linear. It certainly isn't, and I will try to demonstrate loops and interactions between the different phases could potentially look like. Now here are the things I will be covering in every phase. In orange, we will have who is involved or who are you collaborating with. In pink, I will have the purpose or the outcome of every phase. In purple, I will have a simple description of what each phase is. Then in blue, I will have the deliverables that each phase should create or output. And then if necessary, highlighter green, I will have references or tools or other sources that you can refer to learn more. Now let's get into the ideation phase, which is the first phase of the product development lifecycle. The ideation phase is all about generating new ideas and starting to think about what it is that you want to do. So I always think about this as, what is it that you want to do? What do you want to solve, change, or improve, or even create? The goal of the ideation phase is really just to brainstorm without imposing any limits on yourself, all of the ideas that you have. The main thing you want to do is generate ideas. There are no good or bad ideas. An idea is simply an idea. Try to free yourself of thinking about constraints like money, time, resourcing, and just really let your creative juices flow in terms of thinking about ideas that you have or problems you want to solve. Maybe you've seen an idea that works really well somewhere else and you want to replicate that in the context of a software or a product company or a startup. This could be ideas that you have for your products based on customer feedback from your competitors, or just new innovation that you and your company want to pursue, and you're creating new ideas for your product that way. So how can you gather new ideas? Well, it is through, first and foremost, brainstorming, through identifying problems, by looking at existing customer feedback, by doing market research. So this includes looking at competitors of your given product, so on and so forth. But the point here is that you are brainstorming. Now, anyone can be involved in ideation. The more people and different types of thinking you have happening, the more better the ideas that are generated. So in terms of who can be involved, I would say this should be led by product. So you can have product managers. Definitely recommend design be involved as well. And of course, through the process of ideating, you might also be having conversations with engineering, and you should definitely take their input into consideration. But for the most part, because ideation is such a free-flowing exercise and we aren't working with any constraints, try and get as many people involved as you can. Now, the purpose and intended outcome of ideation, I think, is really just to come up with an exhaustive list of ideas. That's really it. You want to build a backlog. Okay, so this could also be considered a backlog of ideas that you can pull from. Even if you're not pulling from it now, you can definitely pull from this at some point in the future. Now, the output and deliverable as a result of ideation could really be anything. It could just be a list. It could even be a photo of post-its that you have brainstormed on a physical whiteboard. It doesn't really matter. The point is that you have dumped those ideas somewhere. The tools that you can consider using for brainstorming would be things like Figma, Miro, and a physical whiteboard. It really doesn't matter. And post-its are also a good one. I will leave some links and references to popular ideation methods. So that's pretty much ideation. Let your brain run free. Don't hold yourself back. No ideas are bad. No ideas are really, really good. Idea is just an idea. Now let's move on to the research phase. So ideation and research are very closely linked to each other. You want to be doing research on hopefully the concepts and ideas that you have come up with in that brainstorming phase. Really, the purpose of the research phase is to validate the ideas that are worth pursuing. Because we have such an exhaustive list, we want to find a way to condense that down into a short list of ideas that we think we can actually take somewhere. Validation will help us figure out the ideas that we should completely scrap, and it's going to help validate the ideas that maybe we need to do a lot more research with. There are two different types of research. There are so many different ways to do research and validate, but the main ones being primary research and secondary research. So primary research really involves talking to people. Perhaps you can do focus groups. A really popular one is to do surveys or questionnaires, and really think about primary research as you being on the ground and going out and fetching a lot of the raw feedback that people have about this idea. Now, if you work in a company, then you can definitely try to access existing customers that you have, but also make sure you talk to internal stakeholders to also get their feedback on the different ideas that you have. Some of the things to consider when you are talking to customers is not just whether they think it's a good idea or if they think it's going to help them and they're going to use it. Also try to gauge whether they would be willing to pay for it. What part of that idea, or if it's a feature, for example, would they actually use versus not use? That can sometimes help you in determining scope or things that are must have versus nice to have. And really, what is their likelihood of actually using it? So when you are doing research and validation on an idea, it's not just about making sure someone, like a customer, likes that idea, but also try to understand their use cases. So what I mean by that is, let's say you are building a banking app. You don't just want to find out if someone thinks they need a new banking app or the features of that app that will be most useful to them. You actually want to find out what problem do they have that this app could solve? What are the specific tasks or jobs to be done that they might be doing? So make sure you think beyond just the idea, the product, and the solution, and actually try to research the underlying goal that the customer has. Now, secondary research is essentially desktop research, right? And when you are doing desktop research, you want to be looking at things like competitor analysis, market trends, and getting a general market understanding. You also want to try and size the market and opportunity. Okay. Now, who is involved in research? Well, this really depends on the size and scale and setup of your company or your team. But I would say first, like a product manager should very much be involved in research, and you should be conducting a lot of your own research, regardless of whether you do or don't have a dedicated researcher. Okay, but if you do, make sure you also leverage a UX researcher. Typically, I found that UX researchers will do longer form types of research. So if you kind of just need some quick real-time feedback, you're much better off doing that yourself as a PM. But UX researchers should continue to work behind you to do research over a longer period of time. That should really help to build a good foundation for anything that you need. And it's also really common for designers to be involved in research. Designers, I found, are really good at facilitating research, especially if it is to do with interviewing people. They can do a great job with putting together workshops and really creative formats of boards to get people thinking in different ways. Now, in terms of the purpose and the outcome of your research, well, that is really to, I would say, come up with a short list of validated ideas. The deliverables as a result of that research could take lots of different shapes. You could obviously have the raw research data, and this is something you will have anyway, but I think it's really important to synthesize that and summarize it in a way that other people, and yourself included, can easily digest it. So I would say summarizing the research into some kind of research doc, or even like a research findings presentation. For something like a competitor analysis, you could put together a comp analysis table, and this could be a part of your research presentation or your research findings document. There are lots of different tools that you can use for research. Some examples are for surveys, keep it simple, and use Google Forms. Right? For some secondary research, in terms of talking to people, you want to capture feedback and put it in something like user voice or product board. In terms of desktop research, see if you can get access to something like Gartner. They do a lot of industry research reports that are published. For talking to people and surveying, you can also use usertesting.com. I also recommend checking out some reports that consulting companies sometimes do when you're trying to understand markets and market trends. So maybe look at like BCG, look at Deloitte. Next, let's move on to the product definition phase. Now, this is part of the planning section, and this is assuming that you have landed on a particular idea, whether that's a specific product feature or an entirely new product with lots of different features to focus on. In my opinion, this is one of the most exciting parts of the entire process, because you get to actually figure out what this product feature is going to do, right? It's no longer just a concept and an idea, but now you're actually working towards the thing that you are going to bring to life. So this is where things get really real. This is also where things can get pretty difficult, because planning, designing, and building a product is no small feat, and you'll start to see why it's such a challenge, because now we do have to somewhat start thinking about limits and constraints that we have. But nonetheless, let's move on with product definition. Product definition is basically, what do you want the product to do? So what we need to think about when defining the product scope is, think first and foremost, use cases. What are the goals and jobs to be done of the people who will be using this product? Goals and jobs to be done. There is no point in defining features and functionality without looking at the underlying use cases, as I mentioned earlier. A useful format that you can use to write a use case is, as a user, and there you want to define who that user type is. I want to do something, whatever that task is, so that I can something, which is the reason why they want to do that thing. So don't forget that format. It's a really commonly used way to phrase use cases. Okay, I think another great thing to do as part of product definition is to get really clear on the why, right? So Alongside writing use cases, make sure you define the problems that you're solving and define the value proposition of what you are proposing. Again, there's no point in just articulating features and functionality. You really need substance to justify the decisions around features and functionality, and that is going to come from use cases, that is going to be backed up by research, and value proposition from a business perspective is really important to be able to articulate. Value proposition could be for the business, it could be for the customer as well. Defining problems is important just because you want to make sure that whatever you are building is solving a problem, right? Yes, you can build things because they are a cool idea, they are innovative, but in reality, people will want to use something because they have a pain point that it's going to solve, and that includes things like convenience. And next, we do want to define product features and functionality. There is a lot that can go into defining product features. So I think honestly, this could be a whole separate video of its own. So I'm not going to go super in depth into how to craft a product feature. Rather, I will leave some links to resources that could be useful if you want to learn more about that. The most important thing I want to call out is when defining features and functionality, you really want to think about prioritizing them and ruthlessly prioritizing them, okay? So there are lots of different ways in which you can prioritize. Again, I will leave a bunch of links to different prioritization frameworks. Alongside prioritizing features and functionality, you also want to define the specific requirement for each feature. So that basically means, going back to the banking app example, if your banking app has a page where people can see analytics for how they are spending their money, the feature is analytics. The feature might be an analytics page or dashboard. But then you need to go in and write the specific details around how that page is going to work. What kind of data is it going to show? What kind of refresh intervals will people have? Can they export and send that data somewhere else? What are the different types of graphs they can view that data in? So take that feature, break it down, and that granular view of that feature is really what the specific requirements are. Okay, and the reason why requirements are important is because you might have some idea of how a particular feature works, but you need to communicate requirements to design and engineering so that they also know how this feature could work. If you have an analytics dashboard for a banking app, there are 1,000,001 different ways in which you can present that data. So you need to be really clear on how you foresee this particular thing working. By the way, writing product requirements is hard. It is really hard, especially when you're working from a blank slate. So go easy on yourself. I would say just put down a brain dump of anything that comes to mind and then refine it over time. It's so much better just to get started than to focus on writing the perfect requirement as a first step. Now, another thing to include in product definition is things like product metric. How are you going to measure the success of the product? Now, it's good to have somewhat of an idea at this planning stage around how you might do that, because it's going to help feed into the requirements for engineering for how they can instrument and build in some of the systems required to collect that data. But it's really important from a business perspective as well, so that you have some metrics that you've defined either as targets or goals, and ways in which you know the product is getting certain adoption or certain usage. You can of course change the metrics as you go, but I think it can serve as a really constructive conversation when someone can share how they are thinking about the most important metrics to calculate for any given product. Here I would recommend looking up the North Star metric, which is a popular read from Amplitude on how you can define that biggest North Star for your product, and all of your other metrics can kind of stem from that. I also think it's important to communicate your thoughts as a product manager on the user experience of the product when you are defining requirements, okay? So it is not a product manager's job to go and design the actual experience. We very much want to leave that to our design counterparts who are experts in that. But if you have any ideas around a really good way to consider displaying something or taking the users through a particular journey, because maybe you've seen that in your research, you've seen that in competitor analysis, then the product requirements doc is just a really good place to reference that. And last but not least, we also want to define somewhat of a release plan. Now, keep in mind, everything at this phase can change. This is just us kicking off the initial planning for pursuing a particular idea. But I think it's important at an early stage to kind of start thinking about how you might iteratively release and build upon this product, right? So you're going to define the features and functionality and the scope of the product, but in reality, you can't build it all at once, most likely. And so as you are starting to form the feature set and prioritize it, think about how you might break this up into an MVP, maybe then a release 1, a release 2, and then maybe continuous releases or something like that from there. But this is also going to help engineering when they think about estimation and sizing and how long it's going to take to actually deliver some of this. I think that's really good coverage for what product definition includes. Of course, there are lots of other things, but I think this is the core of it. Now, the output of product definition is a product requirements document, okay, otherwise known as a PRD. Sometimes people call this a product specification sheet or functional requirements or something like that. But essentially, it is an artifact, typically a document, that details everything around product features, what we have just talked about. Now, I have a whole video on how to write product requirement documents, so I will leave that linked above. Check it out if you are interested. But really, you want to make sure you have a centralized place that is capturing all of your product planning work. Now, a reminder that a product requirements document is a living document for some period of time. You're not going to create a first draft of a PRD and that will be the final. It's probably going to be edited, revised, and probably have multiple versions depending on the size and scale of the product or feature. So label it as a draft, comment engineering and design in it, ask people for their input, including business stakeholders, because you as a PM are the owner of the document and you want to make sure you bring it to closure, but you are not the only person who is feeding requirements into this document. If you are feeling discouraged or overwhelmed with owning that PRD, use it as a collaborative exercise to get input from other people and make sure it's crafted as a living document until you have completely nailed down all of the requirements. Now, there are two other artifacts that relate to the entire life cycle, but I guess product definition specifically, and those are product roadmap and maybe like a product vision or strategy. Now, you are not creating a roadmap as a result of defining a particular product or feature, but keep in mind that this will feed into a greater piece of work around future product planning, which is typically a product roadmap and the product strategy. I've touched on this a little bit, but people involved in product definition, we have design and we have engineering, but it's also important to include other business stakeholders, which can include product and engineering leadership, as well as architects and maybe people like tech leads. And to end off this phase, the purpose of your product definition is really to communicate with everyone what it is that you want to build and why. Now let's move on to the solution design phase. Along with planning the product requirements and the product specifications and scope, we also need to plan the technical side of the product. How it's going to be built, what the architecture will be, what the technology will be, sometimes what frameworks and languages are going to be used, what are the considerations and trade-offs and costs of building in a particular type of way. So solution design really falls to our technical counterparts. It falls with engineering and architects and tech leads. It's not a product manager's responsibility. However, it is important to understand what is involved in solution design so that you can ask the right questions, so that you have an understanding at a basic level of how a given product is built. When you have that understanding, you can better communicate with your engineers, you can better understand some of the trade-offs that might come with future decision making around the product. And overall, it's a good skill to acquire when you can articulate at a basic level how a product is built. And of course, without the solution design, you can't build the product. So it's really, really, really important. However, they need to know what the product definition is in order to appropriately design the technical solution. There are also a few branches that will come off the solution design before we actually get into development. So let's get into it because there's a lot to cover here. So the main purpose of the solution design is how the product will be built. There's a lot that goes into this, but as I am not an engineer and this is not something I would actively work on, I'm only going to share from my observation of what engineering and architecture would actually do in this phase. And one of those things is the architecture design. Architecture might include things like the infrastructure and the databases and the servers. And then the technical design might be more around how those different pieces fit together, how data is flowing from one place to another. And the technical design is really closely connected to how different parts of the product and features actually work, how the front end of the system is connected to the back end, what APIs are needed for the front end to communicate with the back end. From a product manager's perspective, some important things to have input to in the solution design is non-functional requirements. The solution design will take into consideration some non-functional requirements as well. The most common types are scalability, availability, maintenance, and portability. I'll leave a reference so you can look up in detail what all of those mean. But these non-functional requirements, as well as others, can also be inputted from product management into this process, even though this is very engineering-led. Who will be involved in the solution design is typically tech lead, architects, and engineers, and sometimes solution designers if your company or startup has them available, and probably also security. Typically the solution design phase will create artifacts like a architecture diagram and probably a solution design document. If I can find, I'll leave some examples of architecture diagrams and solution design documents if I can find them in the comments or in the description below. And to end with, the purpose of the solution design phase is to communicate how the product will be built. Okay, so while the product definition phase is all about what the product is and communicating the what, the solution design phase is all about communicating the how and probably the why as well. How and why. So being able to justify the technical decisions that are being made. Now the next phase is development. However, before we actually get into the proper software development lifecycle, when we've decided what the product is, we know how it's going to be built, there are some other things we can do in order to further validate the product requirements, the product plan, and the technical solution. Those three things are product design, proof of concept, and a prototype. Now there is no strict order by which you must do these, and in some cases you don't have to do them, but I wanted to include it because it is a part of the product development lifecycle, and hopefully this can show you some of the things that you can consider if you're not comfortable in going straight from the planning section into full execution mode. Okay, so one of the things you might end up doing after defining the product and the technical solution is do a proof of concept, and or you might do a prototype. Now a proof of concept is all about validating the technical capability and feasibility of building the product. Now not the entire product or feature, you're going to look at the very core foundational aspects of the product or feature and see if the technical solution that has been proposed is fit for purpose, how much it's going to cost, the effort involved, and maybe even looking at some possible trade-offs. So the proof of concept is about validating technical capability, while a prototype is validating the general product, its usability, UI, UX, product feature set, and the overall shape and form that the product is starting to take. Validating, I'll just say general product, UI, UX. Now a proof of concept will typically be led by engineers because they basically need to play around with the technology, while a prototype will typically be taken care of by designers. In terms of the tools that can be used, product managers could also get quite involved with the prototype or collaborate with a designer on it, but really the designer should be the one building out the designs, the mock-ups, and then making them interactive. Tools like Figma and Envision are the most commonly used for creating an interactive prototype. Building a proof of concept will really be down to engineering to figure out whatever engineering tools they want to use in order to do that. So I'll also add product managers here. This is not to say that engineers shouldn't be involved in the prototype. Seeing the prototype working, being interactive, will give engineering a really good view of how it should be built, and it might mean that they have to make changes to the solution design. They can pose some questions around interactions and behavior, how data will be flowing from one screen to another. So it is really useful for them to be involved to some extent, but they won't be making, key decisions and actually doing the work of building the prototype. So I'll just put a dotted line between these two just to show that they're not completely independent. They can definitely happen independently. They can happen in parallel. One can happen before the other, but it's really good to make sure that both sides and people working on either the proof of concept or the prototype are talking to each other and sharing findings and learnings and takeaways. Let me draw some linkages between how these different phases work together. So once you have your solution design, you might decide to go straight into development. There is nothing stopping you from doing that. Alternatively, you might say, we have the solution design now and we actually want to spend some time doing a proof of concept. We also want to spend some time doing a prototype. But also, you could go straight from the product definition to the prototype as well. You don't have to wait for the technical solution design, because the prototype is very much focused on the look and feel of the product. Now, having the prototype actually will enable you to do some user testing, as well as maybe some demos to different stakeholders. While the proof of concept could also be used to do some demos. Typically, engineers can find a really scrappy way to show how something works, even if they have to do it purely via an API or not an interface. They can do all that stuff in the background on their IDE, and then they can kind of show you the end result. So hopefully there is a way for them to show you something is working end to end. The deliverables or output that is typically produced at the end of a proof of concept or a prototype will typically be a demo and some kind of documentation. The proof of concept would also have some kind of working code. It wouldn't be production code or ready to release code, but there would be some kind of code that's written. And then for the prototype, you would also have a demo, probably some kind of video. You would also have some kind of prototype file. That could be an app that you can put on your phone. It could be some kind of browser installation. That prototype file could be displayed and used on an app, like on a phone. It could be in a browser. It could just be an application, or it could just be showing a Figma screen and clicking through it. It doesn't really matter. The point is that it demonstrates what the capabilities of the product are, how it looks, and how. And if you're wondering why I haven't mentioned an MVP or a minimum viable product, that is really because I think it comes down to how you decide to release the product. And I did talk about having a release plan in the product definition. So a minimum viable product will just be that first product release. A minimum viable product is not a proof of concept. It is not a prototype. It is something that customers can actually use, but it is limited in its functionality. You're probably releasing the minimum functionality and features, and that's why it's called a minimum viable product. So that's why I haven't called it out specifically, because I feel like it's already covered off in product definition. Now you must be thinking, we've talked about a prototype, but we haven't talked about design. And I possibly could have talked about that earlier. Design, one, they're so critical to this entire life cycle, but also there is no clear point at which design must or should get involved. Try to keep them involved in this process as you go through it. And so you can bring design into the ideation, into the research alongside a UX researcher. They can start doing some wireframing as they are inputting into the product definition. They can start doing some wireframing and some rough mock-ups to even validate some of the early product definition that you're coming up with. So really there's no hard start for design. Let's talk about it now, because we definitely need design before development, that is for sure. Okay, so the purpose of design is to communicate how the product will look and how people will use it. The purpose of design is to communicate how the product will look and how people will interact with it. Some of the key things a designer will do is wireframing. These are usually very early concepts. They will also do mock-ups, which can typically be that next step up from wireframing. And then eventually they will create high fidelity mock-ups which I would say are part of their deliverable or output. And then designers, in parallel to actually doing the designs, they should also be doing user testing. So sharing wireframes with potential customers, getting feedback on them, taking on that feedback to then produce the mock-ups as an example. They will also be defining user journeys, typically called user journey maps. And this is how someone will move through the different screens, what interactions they will have on the screen. Sometimes designers will also end up designing specific components. So while they have an entire screen that they are designing, they might actually have to come up with brand new designs for certain components and elements in that screen because they don't exist already. And of course, like we mentioned, they are probably doing some kind of prototyping if that is required. So the people involved in design will obviously be designers, but they will work very closely with product managers, and they should also work with engineers to help inform their designs and the feasibility of those designs, and also just clarify to engineering when something in the designs is not clear. The artifacts that a designer will produce really are going to be the design files. Those design files can take many different shapes, but ultimately those design files will include the high fidelity mock-ups that then developers can take and actually build out. I think the most common design tools that are used now are Figma and Sketch, but I know designers will often use Miro and Envision as well. There are so many different design tools now. And really the purpose of the design phase is to produce, and really the purpose of the design phase is to communicate how a product will look and behave. So to that point, I'm actually going to change the original description I had of the design phase because I think that's more so the purpose. And instead, the design phase is how do you want the product to look? So let's start drawing some lines between design and other parts of this life cycle. So there is definitely a clear line between product definition and design. You might not get to high fidelity mock-ups when you're still early in the product definition, but like I mentioned, you can start doing some rough wireframes. You could probably do some user testing in the early stages of that product definition to help validate some of those requirements. Design has a very strong and clear line to development because designs are needed in order to actually develop the front end of the product. And of course, there's a linkage between prototyping and design. All right, we're finally at development. I had to make some more space on this canvas, so if things look a little bit different, that is why. We were definitely running out of space, and I've made more room now for us to talk about development. I'm not going to talk in depth about everything that happens in the development phase. Rather, I'm going to share with you an overview of the software development lifecycle because that is really, you know, an engineer's task. I am not an engineer, so I couldn't possibly go into everything that happens in that software development lifecycle. But it is really important for a product manager or anyone working with engineering to have a good grasp of the life cycle they need to go through as part of this bigger product development life cycle to actually build something so that you can launch it. Development is really made up of the software development life cycle. And what does the software development life cycle look like? There is always more planning to be done. So while we've planned out things at a feature or product level, development teams need to actually break down the requirements, both product requirements and technical requirements, and break them down into tasks that can actually be worked on by individual engineers. And you'll be surprised as to how much work is required from a development task perspective for even what might look like a pretty simple feature. Okay, so we really need to give developers the time to do that planning. And typically this planning will take, you know, different shapes and different forms, but ultimately the work that is planned will end up in a sprint, which then individual engineers will pick up individual tasks to actually code. So planning will take into account requirements, whereas design will be the actual technical implementation of how to work on a given task. So in the design phase, the developers will take the solution design and the architecture into consideration and think about how to actually code, for lack of a better word, the given task at hand. It's right? So they will plan, they will design, then they will implement, then they will deploy. This is actually releasing the change. And they will do this across multiple environments. Same with testing, will typically happen across multiple environments, not just straight into the production environment. And then after deploying, there will be a period, typically ongoing, called maintenance. And this cycle will repeat. Sprint by sprint or epic by epic really depends on how a team decides to break up a chunk of work. But this pretty much needs to happen for every change that is released to a product or feature. And that is the software development lifecycle. Again, I will leave a reference here for some good resources to go and learn more about how it works. Typically, the people involved here will be engineers. Sometimes engineers are separate to quality assurance analysts, which is testers. And of course, design and product should still know what is happening. Sometimes there are extra requirements to confirm or scope to clarify. Design should be actively reviewing any front-end changes that are made. So while they're not actually doing the software development lifecycle, they are still a key stakeholder. I do talk a bit about the software development lifecycle in my video on everything a product manager actually does. So I will leave a timestamp and a link to that video above if you want to jump into that, see how I explained it there. Sometimes I find that when you explain things in different ways, they can resonate better. In terms of linkages from development to other areas, we obviously have design very closely linked to development. We also have solution design closely linked to development, which we already talked about before, but I ended up moving that line. Of course, we can also go from proof of concept to development as well. And the product definition, of course, needs to very much feed into development.
11 minutes later.
Okay, I had to take a small break because I'm starting to lose my voice from talking so much. And the sun is starting to go down, so sorry if the lighting changes, but let's get through this final product development lifecycle phase, which is launch. So what is the launch phase? Launch is how you get your product in front of customers, right? And you need to get the product to customers in order for them to actually use it. Now, while it sounds like launching a product is very much a point in time thing, which it is, you will have completed your development, you will have a date for launch and you will roll it out. You'll have some associated marketing and branding material to go along with it. Everything that you do on launch day, the messaging, the positioning, the branding, the marketing, it's going to be long-lived. This is how people are going to remember, discover, and refer to your product. So keep that in mind. So I like to split up launch activities into pre-launch and post-launch. As part of pre-launch activities, this is hopefully in, the weeks, if not months, of leading up to the launch date. Now, pre-launch activities is the things you want to do in the lead up to the release. This could be in the weeks leading up or the months leading up. Your lead time really depends on the size and scale of the launch, the size and scale of your company, what are the processes you need to go through. Maybe you're a small startup and you can just get the launch out and over with pretty quickly. It depends on a lot of factors like that. But essentially, you want to make sure you're setting your product release up for success so that on launch, people know about it, people are excited to use it, and if they want to use it, they know how to use it. And you're also marketing it, positioning it, and branding it in the right way so that it's being discovered by and appealing to the right type of user and customer. So pre-launch activities can include documentation, right? This is the help documentation, the product documentation that customers need in order to actually set up and use the product. Documentation can also be supplemented by things like tutorials, videos, and webinars. You can get really creative here. It's really about finding the right format to educate customers and help them through using your product. Now, pre-launch, you'll also want to prepare some announcements. So typically you would have an internal announcement that would be within your company, letting other teams, letting sales, other product teams, customer support know that this is coming. And then you also want to do an external announcement to customers. This could be a press release, announcement on your company website or a blog. Again, you can get really creative with things in the launch phase. Remember, launching is very closely related to marketing strategy, and we can get really creative with that. So there might be other artifacts that you need to create as part of pre-launch activities. like a website, a landing page for a particular product launch, or maybe some other kind of marketing page on an existing website. Pre-launch, you also want to make sure you know what your product messaging is, what your product positioning is. This is all going to add into how you talk about the product, what type of marketing activities you do, knowing how you're going to position and message your product is a really key part of making sure it reaches the right target audience, positioning it. You also want to figure out the pricing and packaging. So pricing is straightforward. How much are you charging for your product? Packaging can sometimes be how you want to put it inside. It may be existing plans that you have. Is it something that customers are getting for free if they're already using another part of the product? Do they have to upgrade to get this? Really, how are you packaging this new release as part of existing products that you already have, if that's relevant, and how much will you be charging for it? What is the monetization strategy? That's probably the bigger point here, the monetization. Now, post-launch is really all about customer management. Once you have products in the hands of customers, you're going to be getting live feedback and you will need to make decisions about what to do with it. So it's managing customers, it's making sure you have customer service organized, that your internal customer service teams know how to support the product. And I would argue, in fact, pre-launch, you need to do internal team enablement. Now, some of these things like internal team enablement, they're not strictly part of the product development lifecycle. I would say they are a parallel and really important process related track, but I'm putting it down here just because I think it's relevant to talking about all the things that you need to do, but it's not strictly related to product development itself, but making sure you enable internal teams, whether that's sales or customer success, is going to help ensure the success of the product. So I do think it's relevant in that respect. Yeah, so post-launch, you're going to be managing customers. You need to make sure customer service is up to scratch. You also need to make sure you're collecting data, getting product metrics on how your product is being adopted and how it's being used. Linking launch to other product phases. Development will lead to a product launch, and anything you get back from customers once the product has been launched will probably feed back into the development team or back into the product definition for future product planning. Now, the people involved in launch will be product managers and product marketing managers. For the most part, you might have engineering get involved if something goes wrong with the launch. You want to make sure design is on hand if there is a big design blip that happens. But for the most part, I think PMs need to be working with product marketing managers, and marketing managers should hopefully be doing the heaviest lift on the launch. I had to turn on the light because the sun has well and truly set, but I think that is a good cue for me to wrap up. I think this diagram is in a really good place, and I'm going to make 2 different versions of it available. One will be the final copy that you just saw, and another copy will be maybe without all the crazy lines, so you can actually make sense of some of this more easily. There are definitely things that I didn't get to touch on in this video, so if there is something that I missed, please leave a comment down below and I promise to respond to it, because there is just so much, as you can see, that goes on in developing a product. But I do hope this shows you some of the key activities that happen in each phase. As for the different linkages between the different phases, I have tried to allude to those throughout this walkthrough. It can get way more complex than that. All of these red lines that I have drawn, you could draw them back and forth between any phase over and over, because that is a reality of building product. So I've tried to demonstrate with these lines where there should be collaboration and interaction, knowledge sharing between key phases. In reality, it's not always as simple as this, even though this diagram is looking crazy. So just keep that in mind. There will always be lots of interaction happening between different phases, between different people. And that is it for this video. Thank you so much if you got this far. I really do appreciate it. Share this video with someone else who you think it will help. Grab your own PDF of the diagram I just walked through, and let me know what future videos you want to see, and I will see you in my next one. Bye.